They built towers before cities existed. They carved stone with tools we barely understand. And they moved blocks that modern engineers still can't explain. Across the globe, hidden in deserts, mountains, and windswept coastlines, stand structures that challenge everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. These aren't the pyramids or Stonehenge. These are the forgotten monuments, built thousands of years ago by people who weren't supposed to have the knowledge, the organization, or the technology. Yet there they stand. Some predate writing, others defy gravity. A few suggest coordination across impossible distances, and the questions they raise grow louder every year. Who built them? How? And what did they know that we've forgotten? This is the story of 9 prehistoric structures that refuse to make sense. The desert heat shimmers above the sand dunes of Al Ain in the United Arab Emirates. Tourists come here for the oases. Archaeologists come for something far older. Beneath the palms and dust lies Hili Archaeological Park, a Bronze Age settlement that shouldn't exist. It's roughly 5,000 years old, and it represents one of the most sophisticated cultures of its time in one of the least forgiving environments on Earth. The centerpiece is Hili Grand Tomb, a circular stone structure, nearly 40 feet across, covered in carvings of animals and human figures. It's called a tomb, but it's more than that. It's a statement, a declaration carved into limestone. We were here. We thrived. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of individuals. Not scattered, not random, organized. This was a communal burial site used over generations, which means one thing: continuity. The people of Hili didn't just survive, they built a society that lasted. But here's what doesn't add up. The Arabian Peninsula in 3000 BCE was brutal. Temperatures soared above 120 degrees. Water was scarce. Agriculture was nearly impossible. Yet Hili had irrigation systems. They had trade networks stretching to Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. They worked bronze, crafted pottery, and built structures that required serious planning. Where did they learn this? The prevailing theory is that Hili was part of the al-Nar culture, named after an island off the coast of Abu Dhabi. These were maritime people, skilled in trade, who moved goods and ideas across the Persian Gulf. The tombs at Hili match those found on al-Nar Island. Same circular design, same communal burials. But that just raises another question. How did a seafaring culture establish such a strong inland presence in one of the driest regions on the planet? Some researchers point to the ancient Falaj system, underground aqueducts that tapped into aquifers and delivered water across long distances. Evidence suggests these systems were in use around Hili. If true, it means they understood hydrology at a level that rivals much later civilizations. Others argue the region wasn't always this dry. Paleoclimatic studies suggest the Arabian Peninsula experienced wetter periods around 5,000 years ago. Perhaps Hili wasn't built in a desert at all, but in a landscape that could sustain life more easily. Still, that doesn't explain the craftsmanship. The carvings on Hili Grand Tomb aren't crude. They're detailed, animals in motion, human figures with distinct features. This isn't the work of struggling nomads. This is art, which means surplus, which means stability. And then there's the bronze. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was available locally, mined from the nearby Hajar Mountains. But tin had to be imported, possibly from as far as Afghanistan or Central Asia. That's not a simple trade route. That's an organized, long-distance supply chain. For a culture we barely knew existed 30 years ago, that's extraordinary. Excavations at Hili also uncovered evidence of domesticated animals, wheat, barley, and date cultivation. They weren't just surviving. They were farming in a way that suggests knowledge passed down over generations. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Around 2000 BCE, Hili was abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, just left. The people vanished. The tombs remained. The structures stood empty. Why? Climate change is the most popular explanation. If the wet period ended and the desert returned in full force, the irrigation systems might not have been enough. The trade routes could have shifted. Resources dried up, literally. But some archaeologists aren't convinced. If the environment became unlivable, why are there no signs of struggle? No mass graves, no evidence of famine or disease, just absence. Another theory suggests a cultural or political shift. Perhaps the power center moved. Perhaps new trade hubs emerged elsewhere, and Hili simply became irrelevant. Or perhaps, and this is the theory that keeps some researchers awake, they knew something was coming. A slow collapse they couldn't stop, and they left before it consumed them. Today, Hili is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The tombs have been partially restored. You can walk among them, touch the stones, see the carvings up close. But standing there, in the middle of that vast empty desert, one question lingers. If a civilization this advanced could disappear so completely, what else are we missing? At 7,000 feet, on a remote peak in southeastern Turkey, something impossible waits in the snow. Giant stone heads, 30 feet tall, scattered across the summit like pieces of a forgotten game. They stare out over the valleys below. Greek gods, Persian kings, and one man who declared himself equal to them all. This is Nemrut Dağ, and it makes no sense. The heads belong to statues that once sat on massive thrones, arranged in precise rows on the eastern and western terraces of the mountain. Between them, a pyramid of crushed rock rises 150 feet into the air, an artificial peak built on top of a natural one. Inside that pyramid, archaeologists believe, lies a tomb. They've never found it. The man who built this was Antiochus I Theos, king of Commagene, a small Hellenistic kingdom squeezed between the Roman and Parthian empires around 60 BCE. His kingdom lasted barely a century. His monument has lasted 2,000 years. But why here? Why this mountain? Commagene was a buffer state, a political compromise. Antiochus ruled over a culture that blended Greek, Persian, and Armenian influences. His kingdom was multicultural by necessity. Survival meant balancing East and West, Rome and Persia, without offending either. So he built a sanctuary, a place where gods from both worlds could coexist. On the terraces, you'll find Zeus and Apollo seated beside Persian deities like Ahura Mazda. Lions and eagles flank the thrones, symbols of power in both traditions. And in the center of it all, Antiochus himself, seated among the gods as an equal. It was a bold claim. Some would call it megalomaniacal. But here's what doesn't add up: the engineering. The summit of Nemrut Dağ is brutal. Winds howl across the ridge 9 months of the year. Snow buries the site from November to May. Temperatures drop below zero. There's no natural water source, no nearby quarries. Yet Antiochus somehow transported limestone blocks, weighing several tons up a 7,000-foot mountain, carved them into statues, twice the height of a man, and assembled them into a complex that includes 2 terraces, a pyramid, and a network of processional paths. The pyramid alone contains an estimated 150,000 cubic meters of fist-sized stones, hand-placed and compacted. It's not a natural formation. Every rock was carried up that mountain and positioned deliberately. Why go to such lengths? The most common explanation is religious. Antiochus believed himself descended from both Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius. His bloodline, he claimed, united 2 worlds. Nemrut Dağ was meant to be a hierothesion, a sacred burial ground and temple where he could be worshipped alongside the gods. Inscriptions on the site describe elaborate festivals held here. Twice a month, priests would climb the mountain to perform rituals in Antiochus's honor. His birthday, his coronation day, days when the king and the gods were celebrated together. But if this was purely about ego, why place it somewhere so inaccessible? Some researchers suggest the location itself held significance. The summit of Nemrut may have been considered a sacred space long before Antiochus arrived. Local legends speak of ancient rituals performed on high peaks, places where earth met sky, where mortals could communicate with the divine. Perhaps Antiochus wasn't inventing a tradition. Perhaps he was continuing one. Another theory focuses on visibility. On clear days, the monument can be seen from miles away. It's a landmark, a statement of power, visible across the valleys and trade routes below. For a small kingdom trying to assert itself between empires, that kind of presence mattered. But that still doesn't explain the tomb. Ground-penetrating radar has been used. Core samples have been taken. Archaeological teams have spent decades searching for an entrance. The pyramid remains sealed. If Antiochus is buried inside, his tomb has never been disturbed. No looters ever found it. No earthquakes exposed it. After 2,000 years, it's still intact, or it was never there to begin with. Some archaeologists now believe the tomb might not be inside the pyramid at all. It could be beneath the terraces, carved into the bedrock of the mountain itself. The pyramid could be a decoy, a monumental distraction, or it could be exactly what it appears, an enormous grave marker, with the body sealed somewhere no one will ever reach. What we do know is this: the statues weren't destroyed. They fell. Earthquakes toppled them over centuries. The heads rolled down the slopes and came to rest where they sit now, staring out over a kingdom that no longer exists. Antiochus's empire collapsed shortly after his death. Commagene was absorbed by Rome. The festivals stopped. The priests stopped climbing. And Nemrut Dağ was forgotten. It wasn't rediscovered until 1881, when a German engineer surveying the region stumbled upon the heads. Even then, it took decades before serious excavation began. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists make the pre-dawn climb to watch the sunrise from the summit. The heads glow orange in the early light, and for a moment, you can almost imagine what Antiochus saw: a kingdom balanced between worlds, immortalized in stone. But the question remains: what drives a man to build something so massive, so remote, so impossible, knowing he'll never see it completed? And what's still hidden inside that mountain? There's a tower in the West Bank that predates everything, older than the pyramids by 4,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 6,000, older than farming as we understand it. It stands inside the ancient city of Jericho, or what's left of it. A stone cylinder, 30 feet tall, 8 feet wide at the base, with an internal staircase of 22 steps spiraling up through solid rock. It was built around 8,300 BCE. That date alone should stop you cold. In 8,300 BCE, humans were barely settling down. Agriculture was just beginning. Pottery didn't exist yet. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 5,000 years. Cities weren't even a concept. Yet someone built this. The tower was discovered in the 1950s by British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon during excavations at Tel es Sultan, the archaeological mound that contains the ruins of ancient Jericho. She found it buried beneath layers of later settlements, perfectly preserved by the dry desert climate. And immediately, the questions started. Why would a pre-agricultural society build a stone tower? What purpose could it serve? And how did they have the organization, the labor, and the knowledge to construct something this complex? The tower isn't crude, it's engineered. The stones are shaped and fitted. The staircase inside is narrow but functional, carved with precision. Whoever built this understood weight distribution, structural stability, and planning. But they didn't have metal tools. They didn't have wheels. They didn't even have domesticated animals yet. So how? The most immediate theory was defense. Jericho sits in the Jordan Valley, near freshwater springs that made it one of the most attractive locations in the ancient world. The tower could have been part of a fortification system, a watchtower to spot approaching enemies, and there is a wall, a massive stone wall over 12 feet high, running around the settlement. The tower is built directly against it. But here's the problem with the defense theory. There's no evidence of warfare, no weapons caches, no burned layers, no skeletons showing signs of violence. If this was a military installation, where's the military? Some archaeologists argue that the wall wasn't for defense at all. It was for flood control. Jericho sits at the lowest point on Earth, below sea level, in a region prone to flash flooding. The wall could have been built to redirect water away from the settlement. If that's true, the tower might have been an observation point, not for enemies, but for water, a way to monitor seasonal floods and warn the community. But that raises another question. Why build something so elaborate just to watch for rain? In 2011, researchers from Tel Aviv University proposed a completely different explanation. They analyzed the alignment of the tower and discovered something strange. On the summer solstice, the setting sun casts the shadow of a nearby mountain directly onto the tower. Not close, not approximately, directly. It's too precise to be coincidence. The researchers argue that the tower was astronomical, a calendar marker, a way to track the longest day of the year, which would have been critical for an early agricultural society trying to predict planting seasons. But again, the timing is off. The people who built the tower weren't fully agricultural yet. They were transitioning, still hunting and gathering, but beginning to cultivate wild grains. Would they really invest that much labor into tracking the solstice before they'd fully committed to farming? Some researchers think yes. The tower wasn't just functional, it was symbolic, a declaration that this community was here to stay, that they were organizing, planning, thinking long-term. It was a monument to permanence. Others suggest the tower had a ritual purpose. Perhaps it was a platform for ceremonies, a place where leaders or shamrites could address the community from above. Height has always carried symbolic weight, closer to the sky, closer to the divine. The internal staircase supports this. You don't need stairs inside a watchtower. You need stairs if people are meant to climb it, to reach the top, to perform some act that requires ascent. But we'll never know for certain, because the people who built it left no written records, no carvings, no inscriptions, just the tower itself. What we do know is that Jericho was occupied continuously for thousands of years after the tower was built. Layer upon layer of settlement rose above it, burying it deeper with each generation. The tower became a foundation, literally and figuratively, for everything that came after. By the time the city we think of as biblical Jericho existed, the one Joshua supposedly conquered, the tower was already 7,000 years old, ancient even to the ancients. And then Jericho was abandoned. Invasions, earthquakes, shifts in trade routes. The city that had survived longer than almost any other finally fell silent. The tower remained. Modern Jericho sits nearby, a bustling Palestinian city unaware that beneath its streets lies one of humanity's first experiments in monumental architecture. Tourists can visit the excavation site. You can see the tower, walk around its base, peer into the narrow staircase that spirals up through stone. But standing there, in the heat and dust, surrounded by ruins that predate recorded history, one thought becomes unavoidable. If people 10,000 years ago could organize labor, plan construction, and build something this sophisticated, what else were they capable of? And how much of that knowledge did we lose before anyone thought to write it down? Off the southern coast of Sweden, on the island of Öland, there's a stone ring that's been abandoned 3 times. Each time, it was rebuilt. Each time, it was redesigned. And each time, the people who lived there left behind more questions than answers. This is Eketorp Fortress, and it's not like anything else in Scandinavia. The first version was built around 400 CE, late Iron Age. A circular stone wall, roughly 200 feet in diameter, enclosing a cluster of wooden buildings. No gates, no proper entrances, just narrow openings barely wide enough for a single person. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. But here's what makes Eketorp strange. Its location. Öland is flat, wind-battered, exposed. There are no natural defenses, no mountains to hide behind, no forests to retreat into. The island is a limestone plateau rising just above the Baltic Sea, visible for miles in every direction. If you wanted to build a fortress, you'd pick almost anywhere else. Yet someone chose this spot. And over the next 700 years, Eketorp was occupied, abandoned, rebuilt, and occupied again. 3 distinct phases, each leaving its own archaeological signature. The question is why? The most obvious answer is defense. The Baltic was dangerous in the Iron Age. Raiders moved along the coast, targeting settlements, stealing livestock, taking slaves. A fortified structure made sense, but Eketorp's design doesn't match typical defensive architecture. The walls are thick, nearly 20 feet in places, but they're low, too low to provide much protection from attackers. And those narrow entrances, they'd create bottlenecks, sure, but they'd also trap defenders inside if the fortress was breached. Some archaeologists suggest it wasn't built to withstand a siege. It was built to protect livestock. Öland's economy in the Iron Age was pastoral. Sheep, cattle, goats. During raids or harsh winters, villagers could drive their animals inside the fortress walls, keeping them safe while they waited out the danger. That would explain the layout. The buildings inside weren't houses. They were animal pens and storage areas. The narrow entrances would control the flow of livestock in and out, but that theory has problems too. Excavations have uncovered far more than animal bones. There's evidence of metalworking, jewelry production, weaving. These weren't just farmers hiding out during emergencies. They were craftspeople, producing goods that required time, skill, and stability. And then there's the trade material. Glass beads from the Roman Empire, amber from the Baltics, iron tools that show signs of advanced smithing techniques. Whoever lived at Eketorp wasn't isolated. They were connected to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. That doesn't fit the image of a desperate farming community huddling behind stone walls. So what was Eketorp really for? In the second phase, around 500 to 650 CE, the fortress was completely redesigned. The walls were heightened, proper gateways were added. The interior was divided into organized sectors with distinct areas for housing, storage, and workshops. This wasn't a livestock shelter anymore. This was a planned community, and it was built during the migration period, one of the most chaotic eras in European history. Tribes were moving, empires were collapsing. The Western Roman Empire had just fallen. Climate change was triggering crop failures across the continent. Eketorp, in this context, starts to make more sense. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a refuge, a place where people could maintain some semblance of order while the world outside unraveled. But then, around 650 CE, it was abandoned again, completely, for nearly 300 years. No one knows why. There's no evidence of violence, no burned layers, no mass graves. The people just left, and the fortress stood empty while grass grew over the stones and wooden buildings rotted away. Then, around 950 CE, someone came back. The third phase of Eketorp is the strangest. The walls were rebuilt, higher, thicker, more defensive than ever. But the interior was different. The organized sectors were gone. Buildings were crowded together with no clear plan. It felt improvised, desperate. This version of Eketorp didn't last long. By 1300 CE, it was abandoned for the final time. What changed? Some researchers point to the rise of centralized kingdoms. By the High Medieval period, Scandinavia was consolidating. Local chieftains and independent fortresses were being absorbed into larger political structures. Royal power was expanding. Fortresses like Eketorp became obsolete. Others suggest environmental factors. Öland's thin soil was always marginal for farming. Overuse could have depleted it. Climate shifts could have made the island even less hospitable. Or maybe the trade routes shifted. If Eketorp's value was tied to its position along coastal networks, changes in those networks could have made the site irrelevant overnight. Whatever the reason, Eketorp was left to crumble. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1960s, when Swedish archaeologists began systematic excavations. What they found astonished them. The preservation was extraordinary. Stone walls still standing, post holes marking the locations of wooden structures. Artifacts scattered across the site like a frozen moment in time. Today, part of the fortress has been reconstructed. You can walk through it, see the buildings as they might have looked, touch the stones that people stacked 1,600 years ago, but the central question remains unanswered. Why did people keep coming back to this place? What made Eketorp worth rebuilding? again and again on an exposed island with no natural advantages. And what finally convinced them to stop? In the small town of Saumur, in France's Loire Valley, there's a stone structure so large it was once mistaken for a Roman ruin. It's not Roman, it's far older. The Dolmen de Bagneux is one of the largest megalithic monuments in Europe. 75 feet long, 20 feet wide, covered by capstones, massive slabs of rock weighing up to 86 tons each, that rest on upright pillars like a giant's table. It was built around 4,500 years ago, and no one knows how. The word dolmen comes from Breton, a Celtic language still spoken in parts of France. Dol means table. Men means stone. Table of stone. Simple enough. But there's nothing simple about what it took to build one. The capstones alone present an impossible problem. 86 tons is the weight of a loaded semi-truck. Modern cranes can lift that. Modern engineering can move it. But Neolithic people didn't have cranes. They didn't have wheels, pulleys, or metal tools strong enough to shape stone at this scale. Yet they lifted these slabs, positioned them on top of upright stones, and balanced them with enough precision that they've remained standing for millennia. How? Theories range from the plausible to the wildly speculative. The most accepted explanation involves ramps, earthen ramps, built up gradually around the structure, allowing workers to roll the stones on logs, inch by inch, until they reach the height needed to slide the capstone into place. Once the stone was positioned, the ramps would be removed, leaving the dolmen standing free. It's labor-intensive, it's slow, but it works, at least in theory. The problem is, there's no evidence of ramps at Bagneux, no remnants, no compacted soil layers, no telltale marks in the landscape. If ramps were used, they vanished without a trace. Another theory suggests levers and counterweights, wooden beams used to lift one side of the stone while workers place supports underneath, raising it incrementally. Eventually, the stone reaches the required height and can be maneuvered into position. Again, it's possible, but it requires extraordinary coordination. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people working in perfect sync, applying force at precisely the right moments. One mistake, one miscalculation, and tons of rock come crashing down. Would a Neolithic society risk that? Some researchers argue yes, because dolmens weren't just practical structures, they were sacred. These were tombs, places where the dead were laid to rest, where ancestors were honored, where communities gathered to maintain connections with those who came before. That kind of cultural importance justifies enormous effort. Excavations inside Dolmen de Bagneux have uncovered human remains. Not many, most were likely removed or decayed over the centuries, but enough to confirm this was a burial site, a communal tomb, used over generations, where bodies were placed and rituals performed. But that raises another question. Why so big? Most dolmens are modest. A few stones, a single capstone. Enough to mark a grave and protect it from the elements. Dolmen de Bagneux is monumental. It's not just protecting the dead, it's announcing them. Perhaps that was the point. Neolithic societies were transitioning from nomadic lifestyles to settled agriculture. Land was becoming important. Territory mattered. A monument like Bagneux could serve as a marker, a way of saying, this land is ours. Our ancestors are buried here. We belong. It's a claim written in stone. But if that's true, it suggests a level of social organization that challenges our assumptions about Neolithic people. Building something this large requires planning, leadership, resource management, a system for feeding and housing workers during construction. In other words, it requires complexity, and that's what makes dolmens so unsettling. We tend to think of prehistoric societies as primitive, small bands of people scraping by, barely surviving. But structures like Bagneux suggest otherwise. They suggest coordination, hierarchy, long-term thinking. They suggest civilization. One of the strangest aspects of Dolmen de Bagneux is its survival. It's been standing in the middle of a populated area for 4,500 years. Through wars, invasions, urban expansion, agricultural development, it's still there. Luck played a role, but so did reverence. Local legends persisted for centuries about the stones, stories of giants, of ancient kings, of sacred ground that shouldn't be disturbed. Whether people believe those stories or not, they left the dolmen alone. In the 19th century, it was nearly destroyed. The landowner wanted to clear the site for construction, but public outcry stopped him. Scholars intervened. The dolmen was declared a historical monument in 1862, one of the first such protections in France. Today, it sits in someone's backyard. Literally. You can visit, but you have to pass through a garden, walk past flower beds, and there it is, a massive Neolithic tomb surrounded by hedges and modern houses. It's jarring. This thing that predates written language standing next to a suburban home. But in a way, that's fitting, because dolmens were never meant to be isolated. They were part of the landscape, part of daily life. Communities lived around them, farmed near them, used them as gathering places. They were monuments, yes, but they were also reminders of where people came from, of what they were capable of the permanence they could create, even without metal, without machines, without anything but stone and will. Still, the question lingers. How did they know? How did Neolithic people understand engineering well enough to balance 86 tons of rock on pillars and have it stay balanced for 4,500 years? What knowledge did they possess that we've spent centuries trying to rediscover? In western France, near the town of Bougon, there's a cemetery that predates Egypt, not by centuries, by millennia. The Tumulus of Bougon is a complex of 5 burial mounds, artificial hills constructed from earth and stone that date back as far as 4,700 BCE. That's nearly 7,000 years ago, before the pharaohs, before the first ziggurats, before metal tools, and it wasn't built all at once. It was expanded, modified, and used continuously for over 2,000 years. That kind of continuity is almost unheard of. The largest mound, Tumulus A, is roughly 230 feet long and 16 feet high. It covers 2 internal chambers built from massive limestone slabs arranged in a passage grave design. You enter through a narrow corridor that opens into a central room where the dead were placed. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of over 200 individuals, not scattered, not random, organized by family groups, arranged carefully with grave goods placed beside them, pottery, stone tools, jewelry made from shells and bone. These weren't disposable burials. They were deliberate, respectful. The people of Bougon cared deeply about their dead. But here's what makes this place extraordinary: the continuity. Most Neolithic sites were used for a generation or two, then abandoned. People moved, resources shifted, new settlements replaced old ones. But Bougon was different. For 2,000 years, longer than the entire history of Christianity, people kept coming back. Why? The most straightforward explanation is ancestral reverence. Bougon was sacred ground, a place where the bones of the ancestors rested and where the living returned generation after generation to honor them. In Neolithic societies, ancestors weren't just remembered, they were powerful. They connected the present to the past. They legitimized claims to land, to resources, to leadership. Maintaining those connections was essential. A necropolis like Bougon would serve that purpose perfectly. But there's more going on here than simple ancestor worship. The mounds aren't identical. Each one is different. Different size, different internal structure, different construction techniques. Tumulus A is the oldest and largest. Tumulus B is smaller, with a single chamber. Tumulus C has multiple chambers connected by passages. It's as if each mound represents a different phase of development, a different generation's interpretation of how the dead should be honored. That suggests evolution, learning, experimentation. The people who built Tumulus A in 4700 BCE didn't have a blueprint. They were inventing this, and their descendants, centuries later, looked at what had been built and thought, "We can do this differently. We can improve it." That's remarkable. It means they were thinking critically about tradition, honoring it, yes, but not blindly following it. One of the most puzzling aspects of Bougon is the sheer scale of labor involved. The mounds are massive. Thousands of tons of earth had to be moved. Limestone slabs, some weighing several tons, had to be quarried, transported, and positioned. The chambers inside had to be built to support the weight of all that earth pressing down from above. And all of this was done without metal tools, without draft animals, without wheels. The standard explanation involves large groups of people working together over extended periods. Entire communities contributing labor, possibly during specific seasons when agricultural work slowed down. But that assumes a level of organization that's hard to reconcile with what we think we know about Neolithic life. These weren't cities. There's no evidence of large, permanent settlements near Bougon. The people were likely semi-nomadic, moving with the seasons, following game and wild plant resources. Yet somehow, they coordinated labor on a scale that required planning, leadership, and resource allocation. How did that work? Who decided when construction happened? Who organized the workers? Who fed them? We don't know. What we do know is that the people of Bougon weren't isolated. Pottery found inside the mounds shows similarities to styles from hundreds of miles away. Stone tools were made from materials not locally available, meaning trade networks existed. There's even evidence of cultural exchange. The passage grave design used at Bougon appears in other Neolithic sites across Western Europe, from Brittany to Ireland to Scandinavia. Some researchers suggest a shared belief system, a common religion or ideology that spread along trade routes, carrying with it architectural ideas and burial practices. Others argue it's simpler than that. People traveled. They saw what others had built. They brought those ideas home. Either way, it challenges the notion of Neolithic people as isolated and primitive. By the end of the Neolithic period, around 2700 BCE, Bougon was abandoned. The mounds were sealed. Grass grew over them. Trees took root. For thousands of years, they were just hills in the landscape. Local farmers knew they were artificial. You can't miss the scale, the shape, the obvious signs of human construction. But the original purpose was forgotten. Legends grew. Some said giants built them, Others said ancient kings were buried inside. It wasn't until the 1840s that serious archaeological investigation began. What they found stunned them. The chambers were intact. The bones were still there. The grave goods had survived. It was a time capsule, a snapshot of life and death in the Neolithic, preserved under tons of earth for nearly 7,000 years. Today, Bougon is a museum and archaeological park. You can walk among the mounds, enter the chambers, see the stones that people placed so carefully all those millennia ago. But standing inside one of those dark, cool chambers surrounded by stone, you can't help but feel the weight of time. These people had no writing, no cities, no metal, yet they built something that outlasted empires. What drove them? What did they believe? And what would they think if they knew we were still asking questions about them 7,000 years later? On a tiny, windswept island off the coast of Scotland, there's a stone tower that's never fallen. Not once in 2,000 years. No mortar holds it together. No cement binds the stones. Yet it stands 43 feet tall, perfectly intact, weathering storms that have leveled modern buildings. This is the Broch of Mousa, and it's the best preserved example of a structure type that exists nowhere else on Earth. Brochs are unique to Scotland. More than 500 have been identified, scattered across the northern mainland and the islands. Most are ruins, collapsed walls, crumbled foundations, barely recognizable piles of stone. But Mousa is different. Mousa is complete. Its walls rise in a perfect curve, tapering slightly toward the top. The outer diameter at the base is 50 feet. The walls themselves are 13 feet thick at ground level, thinning to about 6 feet at the summit. Inside, there's a central courtyard open to the sky. A staircase spirals upward between the inner and outer wall layers, a hidden passage that climbs all the way to the top. You can walk it today, climb the stairs, stand on the parapet, look out over the North Sea, just as someone did 2,000 years ago. But why they built it remains a mystery. The most common theory is defense. Brochs appeared during the Iron Age, a period of tribal conflict and raiding. A structure like Mousa, tall, thick-walled, with a single narrow entrance, would be nearly impossible to breach. Attackers couldn't scale the walls. They couldn't burn stone. If defenders retreated inside and sealed the entrance, they could hold out indefinitely, provided they had food and water. That makes sense, except for one problem. Most brochs aren't in defensive locations. They're not on hilltops or cliff edges. They're not positioned to control strategic passes or overlook enemy territory. Mousa sits on flat ground near the shoreline. It's visible from miles away. If you wanted to hide from raiders, this is the last place you'd build. So maybe defense wasn't the primary purpose. Another theory suggests status. Brochs were expensive to build, labor-intensive, resource-heavy projects that required skilled masons and community cooperation. Constructing one was a statement of wealth and power. In that context, Mousa becomes a monument, a way for a local chieftain to demonstrate control over resources and people. The broch itself becomes secondary to what it represents: authority. But that doesn't explain the design. Brochs aren't just tall, they're engineered. The double-wall construction, 2 layers of stone with a gap in between, creates structural stability while reducing weight. The staircase inside that gap serves as both access and reinforcement, distributing stress throughout the structure. This isn't primitive construction. This is sophisticated architecture, and it's consistent. Brochs from opposite ends of Scotland share the same basic design: circular plan, double walls, internal staircase, tapering profile. That suggests a shared building tradition, passed down and refined over generations. But where did it come from? There are no earlier prototypes. Brochs appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 100 BCE, fully formed. No experimental phases, no simpler versions that gradually evolved into the final design. It's as if someone invented the concept and then spread it across northern Scotland in a remarkably short period. That's unusual. Most architectural styles develop gradually, borrowing and adapting from neighboring cultures. But Brochs have no obvious predecessors. They're distinctly Scottish. Some researchers suggest external influence, perhaps from Mediterranean cultures with whom the Scots traded. Roman accounts mention trade with northern tribes. Goods moved, ideas moved. Maybe architectural concepts moved too. But if Brochs were inspired by Mediterranean towers, why don't they look more similar? Roman fortifications are rectangular, with flat walls and clear military design. Brochs are curved, organic, almost sculptural. The differences are as striking as any similarities. Another possibility is that Brochs served multiple purposes. Defense, yes. Status, certainly. But also storage, shelter for livestock during harsh winters, communal gathering spaces during festivals or tribal councils. A structure this substantial wouldn't have been built for just one use. Excavations at Mousa have uncovered evidence of habitation. Hearths, pottery, animal bones. People lived here, or at least spent extended periods inside. The central courtyard would have been open to smoke from cooking fires, which means either they tolerated the smoke or they had some way of venting it we can't identify. Life inside a broch wouldn't have been comfortable. The walls, while impressive, would create a damp, cold interior. Natural light would be minimal. Wind would howl through the entrance and swirl around the courtyard. But it would be safe, protected, secure. Perhaps that was enough. One of the strangest aspects of Mousa is its appearance in Viking sagas. Around 900 CE, centuries after the broch was built, Norse settlers arrived in the islands, and they mentioned Mousa by name. In the Orkneyinga saga, a story describes two lovers fleeing to Mousa and taking refuge inside a stone fortress. The saga treats it as ancient even then, a relic from a forgotten age. By the time the Vikings arrived, the people who built Mousa were long gone. Their culture had vanished. Their language was lost, but the broch remained, and the Vikings used it, sheltered in it, recognized its strength. Today, Mousa is a scheduled ancient monument. It's protected, studied, visited by archaeologists and tourists who make the ferry crossing to the island just to see it. But after 2,000 years, the central question remains unanswered. Why did the people of Iron Age Scotland build these towers? What threat were they facing? What need were they fulfilling? And what knowledge did they possess that allowed them to construct something so perfectly that it's outlasted everything else from their civilization? On a mountain overlooking the Atlantic, where Spain meets Portugal, there's a stone city that was never supposed to exist. No central plaza, no grid system, no Roman influence, at least not at first. Just hundreds of circular stone houses, packed together on a windswept hilltop, occupied by people Rome called barbarians. This is Castro de Santa Trega, and it represents a culture that thrived for over 1,000 years. then vanished almost overnight. The word Castro means fortified settlement, and Santa Trega was certainly that. Perched 1,100 feet above the Minho River estuary, it commands a view of the ocean, the coastline, and the valleys below. You can see for miles in every direction. Location like that doesn't happen by accident. The earliest occupation dates to around 600 BCE, late Bronze Age transitioning into Iron Age. By the time Rome arrived in the region, around 100 BCE, Santa Trega was already ancient, and it was enormous. At its peak, the settlement covered nearly 50 acres and may have housed several thousand people. The ruins visible today show over 300 stone structures, circular houses with walls built from granite blocks, fitted without mortar. Each house is small, 10 to 15 feet in diameter. A single room with a hearth in the center and a thatched roof supported by wooden posts. Smoke would escape through gaps in the thatch or a simple opening at the top. They're called Castro's houses, and they're found throughout northwestern Iberia, Galicia, Asturias, northern Portugal. It's a distinctive architectural style, unique to this region and this culture. The people who built them are known as the Castro culture, or sometimes the Celts of Iberia, though that label is controversial. They spoke a Celtic language, used Celtic art motifs, and shared cultural traits with other Celtic groups across Europe. But they weren't Gauls, they weren't Britons, they were their own thing, and they were fiercely independent. When Rome began expanding into the Iberian Peninsula, most tribes either allied with the empire or were quickly conquered. The Castro people did neither. They resisted for decades. Roman historians mention them with a mix of frustration and grudging respect. These were people who lived in fortified hilltop settlements, who knew the terrain, who refused to submit. It took Rome over 200 years to fully pacify the region. And even then, it was more absorption than conquest. What's striking about Santa Trega is how little it changed when Rome finally arrived. In most places, Roman conquest meant transformation. Cities were rebuilt on Roman plans, roads were paved, temples went up, Latin replaced local languages. The local culture was either erased or assimilated so thoroughly it became unrecognizable. But at Santa Trega, the circular houses remained. The traditional layout continued. Yes, some Roman goods appeared. Pottery, coins, metal tools. Trade increased. But the core culture held. That suggests something important. These people weren't conquered in the traditional sense. They negotiated. They adapted, but they kept their identity. Why was Santa Trega so resilient? Part of the answer is geographic. The northwest corner of Iberia is rough. Mountains, forests, river gorges. It's difficult terrain to control, especially for an army used to fighting on open plains. But geography alone doesn't explain it. Rome conquered plenty of mountains. The real answer might lie in the settlement's design. Santa Trega wasn't just a fortress, it was a community. The houses are tightly packed, but there are open spaces between clusters, small plazas where people could gather. There are drainage channels carved into the bedrock to manage rainwater. There are communal ovens, workshops, and storage areas. This wasn't a military installation. This was a functioning town, built for long-term habitation, and it was self-sufficient. The hills around Santa Trega were terraced for farming. Livestock grazed on the slopes. Fish came from the river and ocean below. Metalworking evidence suggests they produced their own tools and weapons. You can't starve out a settlement like that. You can't isolate it. You'd have to take it by force, which means fighting uphill against defenders who know every rock and path. Rome decided it wasn't worth the cost. But here's where the story gets stranger. Around the 2nd century CE, at the height of Roman presence in the region, Santa Trega began to change. Not all at once, but gradually. Some circular houses were modified. A few rectangular Roman-style buildings appeared. Roman pottery became more common. It's as if the culture was shifting. Not because it was forced to, but because it chose to. Trade with Rome brought wealth, new technologies, new ideas, and the people of Santa Trega, pragmatic as always, took what was useful and ignored the rest. By the 3rd century CE, the settlement was a hybrid, Celtic foundations with Roman influences, a unique blend that existed nowhere else. Then, around 400 CE, it was abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, just left. The houses were emptied, the terraces went unused, and within a generation, grass and shrubs had reclaimed the site. Why? The collapse of Roman authority is the most likely explanation. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was fracturing. Trade networks failed. Security disappeared. The benefits of proximity to Roman infrastructure vanished. Without those connections, hilltop settlements like Santa Trega became isolated and vulnerable. Easier to move to the valleys, closer to rivers and farmland, where survival didn't require hauling water and supplies uphill every day. Or perhaps something darker. Plague swept through Europe during this period. Climate shifts caused crop failures. Political instability led to raids and migrations. We'll never know for certain because the people left no written records, just stones and silence. Santa Trega was forgotten for over 1,000 years. Local legends persisted about ruins on the mountain, but no one knew what they were. It wasn't until 1913 that systematic excavations began. What they found astonished them: an entire city, preserved under centuries of vegetation. Today, you can walk through the ruins. The stones are still there, the circular foundations visible, the layout intact. On clear days, the view from the summit is staggering. But the people who built this place, who defended it, who adapted without surrendering, are gone. And the question remains, what does it take to hold on to your identity for 1,000 years, only to let it go when no one's forcing you to? High in the Peruvian Andes, on a peninsula jutting into a freezing alpine lake, there are towers that point toward the sky. Not defensive towers, not watchtowers, tombs. They're called Chullpas, cylindrical stone structures built to house the dead. Some stand 40 feet tall, tapering slightly as they rise, crowned with corbelled domes or flat platforms. The largest stones weigh several tons. They're cut with laser-like precision, fitted so tightly that a knife blade can't slip between them. And they were built at 12,500 feet above sea level, where the air is thin and temperatures plummet after sunset. This is Sillustani, and it's unlike anything else in South America. The site sits on a narrow strip of land extending into Lake Umayo, surrounded on 3 sides by water. The landscape is stark, treeless, wind-scoured, intensely beautiful in its desolation. It's the kind of place that feels like the edge of the world. The Chullpas date primarily to the 15th century, though some may be older. They were built by the Colla people, a powerful Aymara-speaking group that controlled the region around Lake Titicaca before the Inca conquered them. But even after conquest, the Inca let the Colla keep building Chullpas, More than that, they adopted the practice themselves. That tells you something. The Inca didn't tolerate rivals. They absorbed cultures, imposed their language, reshaped entire regions to fit imperial plans. But at Sillustani, they recognized something worth preserving. So what made Chullpas so important? The answer lies in Andean beliefs about death and ancestry. In this worldview, the dead don't disappear. They remain present, active, influential. Ancestors watch over the living, protect them, ensure fertility and prosperity, but only if they're properly honored. Chullpas served that purpose. They were sacred spaces where the mummified remains of important individuals, chiefs, priests, heads of families, were placed in seated positions, surrounded by offerings. The bodies weren't hidden. They were visible through small openings in the tower walls. Family members could visit, leave food, make requests. The dead remained part of the community. But why build them so tall? Height had symbolic meaning. The higher you climbed, the closer you came to the celestial realm, the domain of sun, moon, and stars. Placing ancestors in tall towers elevated them both literally and spiritually, positioning them as intermediaries between earth and sky. It was a form of deification, but there's a practical side too. Andean climates are extreme. At Sillustani, temperatures swing wildly between day and night. Humidity from the lake is constant. Without protection, bodies would decay rapidly. The Chullpas solved that problem. The thick stone walls insulated the interior, maintaining relatively stable temperatures. The small openings allowed airflow, preventing moisture buildup. And the height kept the remains above ground level, away from scavengers. In essence, the towers were sophisticated preservation systems. But here's what makes Sillustani extraordinary: the construction. The stones are massive, some over 6 feet long and 3 feet high. They're andesite, a volcanic rock harder than granite. Shaping them would require tools nearly as hard as the stone itself. Yet the collar didn't have iron. They didn't have steel. Their tools were bronze and stone. How did they achieve such precision? Some researchers suggest they used harder stones as abrasives, grinding, polishing, working the surface over weeks or months until it reached the desired shape. Others propose that they exploited natural fracture lines in the rock, splitting large blocks and then refining them. Both methods work. Both are incredibly labor-intensive. And both raise the same question: why go to such effort? Simpler tombs would have served the same functional purpose, but the Collar weren't interested in simple. They were making a statement about permanence, about power, about their place in the cosmos. The precision wasn't just craftsmanship, it was theology. One of the most puzzling features at Sillustani is the unfinished Chullpa. It's the largest on site, over 30 feet tall, but construction stopped abruptly. Stones lie scattered around the base, partially shaped, abandoned mid-project. Why? The most likely explanation is the Spanish conquest. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532, the Inca Empire collapsed within a decade. The Collar, already subjugated by the Inca, were absorbed into the Spanish colonial system. Spanish priests condemned Chullpas as pagan. They ordered them sealed, destroyed, or repurposed. The practice of mummification was banned. Ancestor worship was suppressed. The unfinished Chullpa at Sillustani is evidence of that disruption. A project started in one world, abandoned in another. But not all the Chullpas were destroyed. Some were too remote. Others were simply ignored as Spanish attention focused on coastal cities and mining centers. Sillustani survived. It was never completely forgotten. Local community continued to recognize the site as sacred, though the original meanings faded. Stories persisted about giants who built the towers, or gods who descended from the sky. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists began serious study. What they found challenged assumptions about pre-Columbian technology and social organization. The Chullpas weren't isolated monuments. They were part of a broader funerary landscape that included smaller tombs, ceremonial platforms, and processional pathways. Sillustani was a necropolis, a city of the dead, carefully planned and maintained over generations, and it was active until the very end. Spanish records mention Chullpas being used as late as the 1550s, decades after conquest. That persistence is remarkable. It suggests the practice was too deeply rooted to be easily erased, even by an empire determined to erase it. Today, Sillustani is a protected archaeological site. Tourists come from around the world to see the towers, to photograph them against the lake, to stand in the thin mountain air and wonder. The stones are still there. The craftsmanship is still visible. You can run your hand along the seams and feel how perfectly they fit. But the people who built them, who believed their ancestors lived in stone towers, who shaped rock with tools that shouldn't have worked, who created something meant to last forever, are gone, and the towers stand alone, pointing toward a sky that no longer answers. From the Bronze Age sophistication of Hili in the Arabian desert to the mountaintop megalomania of Nemrut Dağ, from Jericho's impossible tower, built before farming, before cities, before anything, to the Swedish fortress rebuilt 3 times across 7 centuries. We've seen France's forgotten megalithic tombs, massive and precise, Scotland's towers that have never fallen, Spain's hilltop city that Rome couldn't break, and Peru's towers of the dead, where ancestors watched from stone. Each one raises the same uncomfortable question. How much have we underestimated the people who came before us? We imagine prehistoric humans as primitive, struggling, barely surviving. But Hili had international trade networks. Bougon was maintained for 2,000 years. The Broch of Mousa has stood for 2 millennia without mortar. These weren't accidents. These were achievements. And the technologies behind them? Some we've rediscovered, some we've improved, but some, like moving 80-ton stones up mountains, or fitting blocks so precisely no blade fits between them, we still can't fully explain. Maybe the real mystery isn't the structures themselves. Maybe it's what happened to the knowledge that built them. Because if civilizations this capable could vanish so completely that we barely remember they existed, what else have we lost? And what will be left of us 5,000 years from now when someone stands in our ruins and asks the same question?